Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source software for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? We'll talk about that later. Very excited to talk to our guests today. Before I introduce them, I want to make sure you know who the voices are on this podcast. So I'm Richard Littauer. I'm your normal host. Hello, everyone. Yep, that's still me. And I'm joined today by Amanda Casari. Amanda, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Richard. We had a lot of conversations about you recently from other friends and folks. So it's a delight to see you again, even if it's from across the world, thanks to digital spaces.
I know. I really wish I was at Monktoberfest. Shout out to Red Monk for making such an amazing conference every year. If you haven't been, you really got to go. And if you can't go, that's okay. But if you have the chance, go to Maine. With that having been said, our guest is joining us from another coastal city on the same ocean, but across the pond. So joining us from Liverpool, UK today, we have a research project manager at the Alan Turing Institute. And we are joined today by Batool Almarzouq. Batool, it's great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Batool is an honorary research fellow at the University of Liverpool and the research project manager for AI for multiple long-term conditions, research sports facility at the Alan Turing Institute. And Batool also leads the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia group, OSCSA, OSCSA, kind of like OSCA, but that's different, other side of Africa. She contributes to global initiatives such as Our Ladies Global, while actively promoting open science through various roles, including involvement with the Turing Way, which makes sense. They're housed at the Alan Turing Institute, and the Open Life Science Program, OLS. She's also a jury member for the Einstein Foundation Award for promoting quality in research, and a carpentry instructor. The carpentry, of course, is for teaching scientists how to use code better. So, Batool, that's a lot of stuff. Sounds like you have a lot going on, which is really, really great. Where do you spend most of your time?
Well, I work sort of 4 times a week. I do sort of intensive hours at the Alan Turing Institute. And part of I do sort of project management around sort of helping and supporting large consortia to try and make use of their tools. But at the same time, also, I do what I enjoy a lot, actually, is doing a lot of sort of contributing to a lot of open source and open science sort of community. The one that you've mentioned, the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia, and specifically trying to contextualize sort of open science practices to the Arab region. Saudi Arabia is like a grassroots sort of initiative that focused on capacity building for Arab research. And we do that by collaborating with Arab institutions like the Saudi FDA, KMARC, which is the King Abdullah International Medical Center. We also work with the grassroots community in the Sudan, support researchers with their skills and give them the tool so they can make their research more accessible and open and reproducible. So that's most of what we sort of do and what I enjoy sort of doing.
So I know very little about Saudi Arabia in general. Just the amount of ignorance would be astounding. Can you tell me how many people are in open source community Saudi Arabia and what sort of researchers are they? Do they tend to be students? Do they tend to be people at universities? Do they tend to be people at government labs or private industries? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have 300 and some of them not just from Saudi Arabia, but also from other sort of Arab countries. They basically, most of them comes from academia. So it's life sciences, bioinformatics, computation biology, sort of discipline. So we focus more in how to use that sort of research and make it more sort of open and reproducible. And I think when we work actually with researchers, educators, community leaders from across the Arab region, we see that people genuinely want to make their research more open and engage within open science. But the problem goes back to lack of agency to create their own norms or standards, and also the language sort of barrier. And I think it's one of the huge barrier of them sort of getting to engage within open science sort of community, because a lot of these sort of communities exist within Europe, within USA, not much sort of contextualized to the region.
I have so many questions. So I really appreciate that you're here today to discuss any of this with us. I would love to hear more, Batool, about, is there a vision of what open science could and should be that Open Science Community Saudi Arabia has? And maybe you can speak to some of the components in open science. There's data, there's software, there's documentation, there's publication. Maybe you can talk about this vision that either you or the organization has for what that is, especially for the groups that you work with. And I would love to hear a little bit more about what you just said about the Western focus around the current initiatives around this and localization.
Yeah, so when we speak about open science, if you look into knowledge production within the region, if you look into the civilization before colonization, before the Ottoman empires, actually these sort of value exist in the way that knowledge used to be produced within the region. However, after colonization and a lot of these sort of countries become more dependency in the way that they practice science because they have to catch up with Western norms and standards. There's no way that this sort of system going to be actually able to catch up with the Western norms in terms of ranking, in terms of the way that being created within the system itself. So what we found actually when we work with this community, there are many grassroots even initiatives that align and promote open science, although they're not calling themselves open science. And these are usually very disconnected from the global or the international open science community. And what we're trying to do is making that connection, connecting people from the Arab region with this sort of international community. And both community can learn a lot from the way they practice and understand actually how knowledge should be sort of produced. And I think one thing that I found it very sort of, I'm reflecting a lot on it is pluralism in the way that we practice and create knowledge, how we create pluralistic in terms of methodologies when we actually create and practice science. One of the things that science used to be more transdisciplinary, not multi, transdisciplinary. So science not used to be disciplines. Discipline is something created in the 19th century. Knowledge used to be more sort of connected. So people don't separate humanities, social sciences from art, from applied sciences. And this sort of transdisciplinary sort of framework is the way that the region used to practice science. And I see within Western more sort of trying to create what they would call it also transdisciplinary, especially when they tackle what they call it wicked problem or complex problem, like climate change, like public health problems and that sort of thing.
I love this. Thank you for bringing up the fact of the information and knowledge creation has existed far before the publication industry, that a lot of the current science initiatives really kind of tune for, especially out of Western research and Western universities. I'm curious from that, where do you see for the groups that you work with and the groups that the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia, where are you finding that it is helpful to connect groups and initiatives, and where the ideas that these groups come with on their own is actually the better baseline we should be thinking about or working for in terms of connecting information, knowledge creation, science, and sharing across disciplines rather than moving towards this norm that's not serving anybody?
Yeah, so one of the things that we try to do, for example, you mentioned or shared the Turing Way, and the Turing Way is this sort of global community that created this open source Wikipedia-like materials around open science, trying to simplify, make it more accessible. So when you go to the Turing Way and try to actually to read anything, it's written in not in a technical language. It's something that anyone can understand regardless of their background. However, it's still being sort of created from Western sort of perspective, which is totally fine. And when we do localization, what we're trying to do now is not just localization from English to other language, but also bringing knowledge from these other language when we do the localization. Although infrastructure-wise, we're not supported, most of the infrastructure that exists, what we call a translation management system that people use to integrate and make localization is easier with GitHub and using glossaries, the way that they design and make workflow to translate and localize open source, make it not very possible. But we're trying to look into ways of making that possible, or at least bringing that knowledge into the community calls, into different places where they actually can contribute with their own way of understanding open science. Because open science can mean different things to different people. Some people see it more about agency and how they sort of claim that agency around knowledge production and how they create knowledge.
So I brought up on the last podcast I was on with the Public Knowledge Project about Katanga and Maori ways of doing things, which are really important here where I am in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is trying to think about decolonializing science and decolonializing access to Western education, et cetera, by allowing indigenous and local perspectives on how knowledge should be worked into everyday occurrences. And so that makes a lot of sense to me, although it's difficult because I was raised in a Western perspective. And so that's the one that I just see from all the time. So I have to unlearn that. When listening to you talk about localization and about the importance of local communities and the importance of an open source community for Saudi Arabia, it makes sense to me what you're doing, but I'm struggling to figure out how it works on the ground. I know that there's this really awesome tool called Kalb. It's open source. It's by a guy called Nasser on GitHub. It's amazing. It's awesome. And that seems really clear to me. Hey, let's use that instead. Let's just transliterate. But besides transliteration, what else are you doing on the ground to sort of inform how you all work together and how you bring a non-Western perspective to the sciences?
The reality is grassroots sort of initiative that based on volunteers, and all of us also have our own sort of full-time jobs. So the way, as I mentioned, is there's no system that we use in place, recording or creating things. It's more about just connecting people and creating that space for this discussion to grow. We have created very recently, we call the open innovation. It's like massive open courses that we're trying to record and add some of these sort of understanding as courses inside this platform. So the platform being created, designed, we have documentation, but still these courses not sort of being added. But again, I think there is a privilege also to be able sort of to come to the UK, did my undergrad, my PhD, and to be connected to this international open science community. And I think what I'm trying to do is actually bring in these people who don't have this connection to also creating a space where this conversation can actually start. And in some spaces, sometimes it's not just researchers. In some of these spaces, you find funders, policymakers, people from different places that also sort of take this conversation and initiate it in different places. And I think that's how we sort of try to invoke this conversation in the space, because when I go in a lot of these open science sort of conferences or events, I find a lot of sort of focus on infrastructure sort of things without like thinking about sort of the social layer or like how to actually contextualize it with the Western world.
I love how this question of how do we think about actualizing this? So if you have a vision, you have needs, how are you moving forward? And it sounds like right now there's immediate need in time and effort, not just for education across and within this group, but also it sounds like you're doing some work around helping folks understand how the values and the tenets that they believe in exist elsewhere, but maybe using different language. You know, we spent a lot of time with this, where what's the difference between open source and open science and open data. And it can feel very nitpicky to some individuals, but I think other folks trying to explain when you're just striving for clarity, when it becomes necessary for folks to understand and connect, like you said, for funding initiatives, for understanding how their work can be supported by peers, how they can find colleagues, how they can find scientific collaborators. It sounds like that's also something that you're working hard to do for the folks in the communities that you're connected in, is helping them to see what level of support they can get they may not currently be aware of.
Yeah, it's basically making that sort of connection and providing this sort of opportunity for people.
Maybe then, Batool, can you speak a little bit more about, you had mentioned briefly like the workflows and translation management systems. Can you talk a little bit more about the very specific tooling that either you or folks you've been connected with are working on, and what they are, what problems are they solving for? But also, if you had a chance to ask for more folks to be involved, what does that look like?
I think the most important thing when we think about translation and localization, there's a difference between translation and localization. So localization is one step further than translation by taking into account the context and the culture. That's why when you go to Wikipedia sometime, I don't know if Wikipedia is the best example, but when you contextualize them, it's going to look very different in different culture. That's basically localization rather than just literal translation. And when you do that with open source sort of systems, let's say you're trying to localize an open source tool or localize an open source sort of materials like the Turing way, very important that you use a tooling that basically can connect with GitHub, GitLab, one of these sort of platforms, but also trying to make translation very consistent, especially if you have community-led localization where you have volunteers that comes and go. And you want to make sure that localization that they are making actually also sort of consistent. So to do that, you need to create a glossary, you need to create something called translation memory. And to do all of that, there's something system that industry created called translation management system. And this translation management system, example of it, Crowden, Transfix, Localize. But when we did a research, I think, was it 3 years ago, and it could have changed now, we researched all the TMS. Most of them say they support right-to-left language, but then when we actually try to use them, they don't. And then also we try to look into TMS that is open source, and we couldn't find one that is actually maintained, still maintained. The one that we found back then, and again, it could have changed now, they were not maintained because they didn't have funding and they were sort of discontinued, if that makes sense. For example, GitLab is localized using Crowden. All of them use technologies that are actually not open source to localize an open source technology. One thing deserves sort of saying about these sort of tools, even though it's not open source, they try to support open source. So if your tool is open source, they don't ask you to pay for anything. Transfix, you pay for specific features. Again, it depends on what tools you're trying to do. And I think these tools, because it has this translation memory, again, I say translation memory, I mean it allows you to reuse translation in the same project or in different projects. So it makes translation sort of more consistent and high quality. It also has sort of integration with machine translation. So again, machine translation is like ChatGPT, AutoML, any of the Microsoft Translate and that sort of things. But we also know that machine translation can speed up the process, but also you can't sort of really rely on it. You need the translator sort of to improve that translation. There's a lot of a huge chance of bias, especially ChatGPT when translate things related to Muslims. I think you both know better than me that like ChatGPT is wrapped around GPT-3, which when came up 3 years ago, do auto-completion. You start a sentence and 80% of the time create sort of paragraph that has something related to bombs, violence, terrorism, that sort of thing. Again, it goes back to how these sort of system or large language model being trained on the internet as a corpus. So a lot of these translation management system has also other features like checking spelling, mistake, grammars, but also it makes contributors who come to sort of make contribution on localization, their way of contribution doesn't have to be just through translation. It could be through reviewing. It could be through just understanding the infrastructure. It could be through just sort of leading, managing sort of one language. And also they don't need to know anything about GitHub. They don't need to know anything about open source. They sort of just interacting with this TMS. However, all of their name and acknowledgement get built into GitHub. So they are acknowledged also inside GitHub, even though they don't have an account inside GitHub. And I think that's very sort of important when you sort of trying to do community-led sort of localization and bring in people. But just going back what you said about one thing that I would like to see is actually more support or funding around creating sort of open source TMS, or even really more support around localization in open source, because multilingualism is very, very important in open source. But there is also inconsistency between most of the funding models. It doesn't cater for what I would call de-internationalization. Like it doesn't incentivize internationalization, if that makes sense. It's more incentivized de-internationalization.
That makes a ton of sense to me. It's really difficult in this field to get funding for localization efforts. It's really difficult to get funding for smaller things that aren't global AI, fix the world, make everything great again type stuff. But at the same time, localization is kind of the antidote to a lot of the ills that we're seeing in terms of AI, right? Because it allows people to figure out where they are and build in local communities. I love the work you're doing. That is super, super awesome. I have a question based on it. Because a lot of the times people spend so much work building these amazing tools to help localize their communities, but then don't follow up with ground efforts, with making sure that people get involved who aren't technical, with making sure that it's not just people building the most finely tuned tool that never gets used. And so I want to know about OSCSA's or any other community that you're in, what it looks like on the ground, bringing in people who aren't technical. How do you ensure that the localization efforts don't stay within your own technical community?
We write documentation in a way that people who are not technical at all be able actually to contribute. And actually, most of the contributors to localization are not technical people, or they just starting to understand or want to go to know open source, and they start with localization. Most of the contributors that you found them in the README file, they actually boiled down from crowding. They don't have an account inside GitHub itself. So it gives something called similar to all contributors. So it will their ID, photo, and then their contribution, how much they sort of localized or reviewed, or any sort of contribution they made, and it's added to the README file of that project. Also, within the open science community Saudi Arabia, what we do is we created this sort of MOOCs platform that tries to introduce open science practices and contextualize it to the region. It's multilingual. But when we were creating it, we used JavaScript sort of libraries. And what we found with JavaScript libraries, documentation, we wanted this not just us sort of creating or adding lesson, but also people come in and add in their lessons, add in their materials. So making contributor also from the community and an easy way for them to add without having to know anything about JavaScript, just using like the platform itself. And when we were doing sort of documentation, because we use JavaScript, the most library that you use for documentation for JavaScript is called GSDocs. And GSDocs is very hard to have that documentation both in English and Arabic. And you can do it, but you have to make a lot of sort of tricks and work around sort of to create and make a multilingualism. So what we did, this tool, you're able to document things that you created using JavaScript, but at the same time, it's multilingual. So it supports sort of right to left language. And now we have the documentation itself, both in English, both in Arabic. People who don't know at all about tech coding, they're able to go to this documentation and actually read it and then sort of applying this step by step. And the step that we're trying to also is not, well, add this code in your terminal. We created something very user-friendly inside the platform, like an admin page where they can sort of add things very easily into it. But again, step-by-step sort of documentation, making it very easy for them sort of to go into it. So what you mentioned about engaging non-technical community actually is really, really important, because otherwise you really engage in exactly the same community. And not everyone in academia have the privilege to actually learn coding in their sort of degree. And I think people who come from disciplines don't get a training around coding. They bring also a lot of knowledge around sort of open science and around also understanding and align with the values and objectives that we're trying to create within the community itself.
The breadth of the groups you work with, by the way, is so impressive. So thank you for doing such amazing work across so many different Our Ladies and the Open Science Community Saudi Arabia. And I know the work that you're doing with the Turing Way. I'm super curious. Is there anything that you are talking and working across communities that has surprised you, that you weren't expecting when you first started, maybe either engaging with them, or that you brought in a different expectation and now you're really grateful that like you learned that from either that group or from that new initiative you started with them?
I think I've learned a lot from the Latin America sort of community. When I engaged within the Carbon Trees and Our Ladies, there's a huge Latin America community who is also doing a lot of localization. I mean, Spanish is left to right and it's using Latin script, but still like the work that they do is really, really huge and amazing, especially in the art community and a lot in open science. And they also try to localize sort of books to their community. And I think I've learned a lot about their ways of working across the community itself, how they design themselves and how they sort of acknowledge the contributors that comes from volunteers. It was very, very inspiring for me working with them. And I think it's also affected how I came sort of to do this work within the Arab region.
I'm really glad you brought up the Latin American community. They share something with Northern Africa and parts of the Middle East, which is that they're not necessarily in the same rung as some larger Western countries in terms of political power for coders and for communities of practice. This is where I'm trying to focus here, not on everything else. But it's hard to be someone who's multilingual, who comes from a different language, who comes from a different region, who doesn't have access. You've already mentioned your own privilege being able to go to the UK. I also had that privilege. It was fantastic for me, but I already speak English natively. And so I'm just curious, if you had to offer any advice for other people around the world in other areas that are also facing difficulties accessing global markets and dealing with open source in a way that brings in funding and enlivens communities, what would that be?
There's two places that I think I got a lot of value from outside, even more than academia. It's basically engaging with community practice and also finding mentors. I find my mentors through these community practice, but other people can find them in different way. And I think these two sort of helped me a lot in what things that I wanted to do and what sort of message I'm trying to deliver, and also how I design sort of my activity. A lot of these countries that you mentioned, it's not that they lack resources, but it's just the way that politics works and this sort of power dynamics that makes them actually not able to create a lot of the things that otherwise they would be able to create. And that's what brings me back to what I said earlier about making this connection, because when I try to make this connection and try to introduce people, and hopefully they get also to find mentors, to find people who they can actually relate to them and help them and support them, either in their career or also in the things they're trying to achieve. I was reconciled by a lot of the conversation that I made with people in these communities and finding that they relate to a lot of the things that I'm also thinking about, because sometimes you can be thinking a lot of things and you might think you are the only one who's sort of odd, and finding people who relate to you and relate to your ideas and also help you to articulate them better and see what people are trying to do and working toward that sort of collective action together gives you a lot of power. So I think there's a lot of empowerment from connecting people, from finding mentors, from engaging in these community practices outside academia, outside the hierarchy that exists in these sort of academic structures.
Batool, this has been really awesome. I wish we had an infinite amount of time, but we do not. So thank you so much for coming on. Where can we learn more about the work that you do? Do you have a website, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, we do have a website. Going to give it to you so you can add it. We also add all of our resources, sort of talks that we give in talks in Zenodo. So you can find them also as one collection and you can go through them.
Thank you so much. And you can find all of those links on the show notes, listeners. Batool, that was great, but don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. Spotlight is a part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we think need a little bit more light put on them. Amanda, what is your Spotlight today?
Batool, thank you for the lovely reminder of Our Ladies. This is not something new, and by all means is not something that doesn't have spotlight shined on it. But very personally for me, the first open source community space that really extended that space towards me was PyLadies, which I used to do more with, especially as a local and regional organizer. My favorite thing to do is move chairs and to go get pizza. It's like the base level, taking care of other people and making sure that they also knew they were welcome, but in a way that allowed me not to maybe focus on my own concerns about whether or not that was someplace I deserve to be. So I think PyLadies continues at a lovely pace of trying to extend and create spaces for those who need it, as well as for those who want to build it for others. They also are kind of a near organization, I think, with PyLadies, and I just appreciate them both so much.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. I was thinking about my own battles, might be the right word. And so I wanted to highlight American atheists today, which might seem a bit odd to most people, but I grew up under Christian fundamentalism. My parents are evangelicals and very repressive, and it was very difficult for me. And this is maybe the opposite of everything you said, where I would discourage joining local groups, because local groups tend to be incredibly angry because people have a lot of issues that they have to work through, and they try to go here instead of to a therapist. But American Atheists, as an organization, works to ensure access to the law for everyone in the US and combating the rise of Christian fundamentalism, which I think is a worthy goal because it allows people of other faiths to also exist in America. So I would highlight the work of American atheists as someone who is actually trying to build a more ecumenical world, which is kind of ironic, but that's sort of how I'm seeing it in my head. Batool, what is your spotlight today?
One person that I would like to mention is someone who sort of helped me a lot in tremendously articulate my vision around localization, like creating also logic models around the impact that we're trying to achieve, who is Alicia Carroll, and she used to work in the carpentry. And even after she left the carpentry, she still sort of meet with me, trying to help and support the impact that we try to do with localization. I want to also mention two other people who actually did a lot of the heavy lifting around the mocks and GS Quad 2 and a lot of the tools that we have inside the open science community with Sandy and Rishi. They're really amazing people who have a lot of creativity, and they basically designed a lot of the heavy lifting in creating a lot of the tools that I've mentioned actually today.
Thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there are a few things you can do. First, you can email Richard at sustainoss.org and complain about the first 3 questions, and maybe just say you should say something else at the beginning of the podcast. Or you could just give us cool thoughts and ask us, hey, should we have other people on, other guests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can also go to opencollections.com/sustainoss and donate. This podcast is not free. Our editor needs money and food and wine. So make sure you can enable him to have that. That would be the best. You can also go to sustainoss.org and discourse at sustainoss.org and join in conversations around sustaining open source software, which would be really, really fun because that's the whole point. That's why we're here. And if you feel like you have conversations already with people about those things, why don't you mention this podcast to them? That would be really great. Sharing is caring, as Maria Popova loves to say. Donating is loving as well. And finally, if you enjoyed this podcast, you can go to the show notes on podcast.sustainoss.org. Click on all the links that Batool has mentioned. She's doing amazing work. You can follow up with her and her awesome communities. Hopefully get involved both locally and globally, although it's very hard to do that all the time. Just continue being the best humans you can, as Batool was today. Batool, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, everyone.